Before becoming vice president, Lyndon Johnson had represented his home state of Texas in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Technically a Southern Democrat, he was against racial discrimination, and he actually fought for the Civil Rights Act of 1957. I think a lot of people would be surprised to know that Johnson and Kennedy didn't actually like one another. As a matter of fact, both of them were running in the 1960 election for president. But Johnson eventually joined Kennedy's ticket because he knew that the young senator was far more popular with the voters. Johnson thought Kennedy was weak and naive, and Kennedy thought Johnson was crude and aloof. But the political situation called for it. Kennedy chose Johnson to balance the ticket. You see, presidential candidates often choose a running mate that appeals to a demographic the candidate can't reach. In this case, that demographic was the American South. At 6'4" and 230 pounds, Johnson was significantly larger than most of his contemporaries, and he used his size to intimidate other politicians in private meetings. This was called the treatment. He would yell, kick, push, plead, and shout until they gave in and agreed to his demands. As a young man, Johnson taught black children in a segregated school, and as a congressman, he worked to improve the lives of black and Mexican citizens in his Texas district, even though he voted against large-scale civil rights bills in Congress. So, Johnson was a true politician. He sincerely cared about racial progress in the United States, but he also voted against large civil rights bills when it was politically convenient for him. By the early 1960s, civil rights legislation had been locked up in Congress for years, but Johnson's negotiating tactics, that abuse we talked about, as well as some bribery, helped get a few of those laws passed. This iconic picture captures the scene on Air Force One, only 2 hours after Kennedy's death. Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as president on a plane back to Washington, D.C. Johnson had to serve out the rest of Kennedy's term, which meant he would have to campaign for a second term the next year. But support for Johnson was high in the 1964 election. The only states he lost were Arizona and those in the Deep South. The Texan had lost the South's support because of his left-wing policies and his passionate support for desegregation. He wanted to create a society based on racial equality, and he called his vision for the United States the Great Society. The overall goals of his Great Society program were to end poverty and racial injustice. As president, Johnson fought for federal education funding, expanded health care, and a war on poverty that included money to rebuild rundown black neighborhoods in America's cities. He wanted to reincorporate black communities that had been driven out of mainstream American life. In the early months of 1964, America was still mourning the death of President Kennedy. So Johnson encouraged Congress to honor the former president's memory and pass the civil rights legislation that Kennedy had hoped to sign into law. After months of debate, the Civil Rights Act was signed into law on July 2, 1964. It made discrimination based on race, gender, religion, or nationality illegal. The Civil Rights Act was still a huge victory for the United States, but it didn't end racial injustice overnight. Black Americans were still being denied the right to vote in some areas of the United States, specifically the South, and they still were being driven into poverty by racist economic policies. Despite the violence directed at them, civil rights protesters marching for the right to vote maintained peaceful, nonviolent demonstrations. In 1965, black protesters in Alabama who marched to public buildings with the hope of registering to vote were routinely arrested or beaten. On February 18, 1965, a man named Jimmy Lee Jackson, shown here, joined one of those marches, along with his mother and 82-year-old grandfather. Suddenly, police began attacking the peaceful protesters and the reporters covering the event. Officers chased and beat Jackson's mother and grandfather, and Jackson was shot twice in the stomach when he tried to protect them. He died 8 days later. Jackson's death set off a wave of new protests, which were met with the same violent response. Horrified by the murder, civil rights leaders decided to make it a key component for their next action. On March 7, 1965, activists set out to march from Selma, Alabama to the capital of Montgomery, a distance of 54 miles. They planned on asking the governor to explain why the police had attacked the protesters in Marion and caused the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson, but they never arrived. As hundreds of activists were crossing a bridge out of Selma, state troopers, local police, and ordinary white citizens all attacked with nightsticks and tear gas. Reporters caught images of mounted troopers running down protesters and beating men and women being carried away for help. The day became known as Bloody Sunday. After watching footage and seeing reports of Bloody Sunday, Viola Liuzzo, who's pictured on the left, heeded the call of Martin Luther King Jr. and traveled from Detroit, Michigan to Selma, Alabama. She participated in the successful Selma to Montgomery marches and helped with coordination and logistics. At the age of 39, while driving back from a trip shuttling fellow activists to the Montgomery airport, she was fatally hit by shots fired from a pursuing car containing KKK members. Also answering King's call was a white minister from Boston, James Reeb, pictured on the right. He was also beaten to death by segregationists, an act that turned Southern resistance to black voting rights into a national outrage. President Johnson encouraged the creation of the Voting Rights Act, a law that would eliminate all obstacles in the way of disenfranchised black Americans who wanted to vote. He became the first president to say, "We too shall overcome." The cry of the movement. The Voter Rights Act was a victory for President Johnson, but he couldn't rely on Congress alone. He also appointed judges and lawyers who would be sympathetic to the cause. His most famous appointee was Thurgood Marshall, an NAACP lawyer who became the federal government's Solicitor General at Johnson's request in August 1965, the same month that he passed the Voting Rights Act. In 1967, President Johnson went a step further and appointed Marshall to the Supreme Court. Just as he was the black Solicitor General, he became the first black Supreme Court justice. But he wasn't only the first black Supreme Court justice. He, too, was a civil rights activist himself. The former NAACP lawyer had successfully argued in favor of school desegregation in the Brown versus Board of Education case in 1954. Thurgood Marshall served on the Supreme Court until 1991. With a black justice on the Supreme Court and the Voting Rights Act giving political representation to black Americans for the first time, civil rights leaders turned their attention to economic discrimination, one of their toughest challenges. The injustice of being confined to poor, run-down areas of the country led to protests at the height of the civil rights movement. In 1966, civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. led the Chicago Freedom Movement to demand equal housing opportunities from the city. Similar protests took place in other parts of the country. But in 1968, after years of minimal success, King was shot and killed as he stood on a hotel balcony. Fury erupted into riots in cities all over the country. Once again, Johnson used a moment of grief to push forward legislation. He urged Congress to pass the Fair Housing Act, which made discrimination in housing opportunities a federal crime. It passed Congress, and Johnson signed it on April 11th, just 1 week after Martin Luther King Jr.'s death. In the final years of his presidency, Lyndon Johnson was a deeply unpopular president. His escalation of the Vietnam War alienated politicians of both parties, and some Americans blamed him for the unrest in America's cities. Johnson joined the ranks of few American presidents and decided that he would not run for another term, even though his first term was so short that he could have.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Despite his poor approval ratings toward the end of his presidency, Johnson was proud of his 3 pieces of civil rights legislation: the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act.